This video was brought to you by Brilliant. The Russian economy isn't having a great time at the moment. Despite some absurdly steep interest rate hikes, inflation has remained stubbornly high, rising to 9.5% in December, and the ruble is now worth less than a cent. Nonetheless, despite all of this, state finances have always looked remarkably stable, and while spending has gone up, largely thanks to a rising military expenditure, this hasn't put as much strain on the Kremlin as you might expect. According to official statistics, the defense budget only amounts to about 8% of GDP, which isn't that high for a country fighting a full-on war, and the Kremlin is only running small deficits. However, according to a new paper by Craig Kennedy at the Navigating Russia Substack, this is in part because the Kremlin is apparently forcing Russian banks to lend money to war-related countries, downplaying the real cost of the war and risking a financial crisis. So in this video, we're going to take a look at how the Kremlin has weaponized Russia's banks, why this presents yet another economic risk to Putin and co., and how worried he should be about it. Who's the worst politician right now? Hear our thoughts and argue with us on our podcast, The World Leader Leaderboard. Find it on the TLDR Podcast YouTube channel or in your favorite podcast app. So let's start by looking at Kennedy's report. The big finding in the report is that the Kremlin is basically using not just the military budget, but also off-the-book loans from commercial banks to finance its war in Ukraine. This is largely a consequence of a law enacted back in February 2022, days after the invasion, that requires Russian banks to extend preferential loans to law-related businesses on terms set by the state. This is apparently what explains the drastic increase in corporate lending by Russian banks, which increased by nearly 50% or $415 billion after the invasion. For context, this amounts to nearly 20% of Russia's GDP and is more than either the defense budget or the Kremlin's hydrocarbon revenues. According to Kennedy's analysis of sectoral lending data, over 70% of this surge has come from loans to war-related industries like arms manufacturing or metallurgy. Now, the important thing to stress here is that because the Kremlin presumably had to force banks to issue these loans, they'll generally be pretty risky for the bank. In other words, they'll probably be to war-related companies that the bank otherwise would deem uncreditworthy, i.e. unlikely to pay the loan back, or they'll be at a lower interest rate than the bank would otherwise require. And this is why lending has surged. It's not just that there suddenly was a whole load of great Russian companies that banks were happy to lend money to, but rather the Kremlin is forcing them to lend to these riskier companies at favorable rates, hence the surge in overall credit creation. Now, this shouldn't come as a total surprise. After all, officially, the Kremlin claimed that it was only spending about 8% of its budget on defense, which would be high by international standards, but lower than you'd expect for a country fighting a full-on ground war. This would also explain why the central bank's super steep interest rate hikes haven't cooled inflation. As we've covered in previous videos, Russia's year-on-year inflation rate has risen steadily over the past 2 years or so, from a low of 2.3% in early 2023 to a recent high of 9.5% in December. In an attempt to tamp down inflation, the Russian central bank has duly hiked benchmark interest rates from 7.5% in early 2023 to 21% at the moment. This is stupidly high. For context, interest rates are currently running at about 5% in the US and Europe. But despite that incredibly high rate in Russia, inflation has remained stubbornly high in the country and actually rose quite dramatically in December. This is presumably because, while higher interest rates have dampened household borrowing, corporate borrowing has continued to increase, as the Kremlin forces banks to lend money to war-related companies at favorable rates, which means more money sloshing around and therefore higher inflation. Anyway, you get the idea. The Kremlin has been using a two-track strategy to both cover and downplay its mounting war costs. So, how worried should Putin actually be about all of this? Well, broadly speaking, there are two ways of looking at it. The first interpretation is the one offered by Kennedy, and that is that it represents an acute risk for the Russian economy, and therefore the Kremlin. Essentially, if lots of these companies default on their loans, then Russian banks could go bust, sparking a full-scale financial crisis. Similarly, if Russian depositors realize that their money is being loaned out to dodgy companies, they might start withdrawing their cash, potentially sparking bank runs and a full-on crisis. Kennedy stresses that this sort of credit event risk poses a qualitatively different type of risk to the Kremlin than any other attritional risk to the Russian economy. In his words, unlike the slow burn of inflation, credit event risks such as corporate and bank bailouts is seismic in nature and has the potential to materialize suddenly, unpredictably, and with significant disruptive force, especially if it becomes contagious. Analysts who subscribe to this interpretation generally conclude that Russia is weaker than it looks, and that the West should escalate its sanctions to push the Russian economy into crisis and thus force Russia to the negotiating table on favorable terms for Ukraine. However, the second interpretation, the one offered by analysts like Adam Tooze, is that while this obviously isn't great news for the Kremlin, it's not an acute risk for Putin and co. Analysts on this side of the aisle argue that, essentially, the Kremlin and Russian central bank are actually pretty competent economic managers, as evidenced by their relatively effective response to the West's sanctions campaign. And they have the monetary tools to deal with either a credit crunch or bank run. In practice, this would probably just involve the Russian central bank backstopping any affected banks, promising to basically print rubles for them until A, they've been bailed out, or B, their depositors regain trust and put their money back into the bank. Now, this would still be bad news for the Russian economy. Even if a full-scale crisis were averted, turbulence in the banking sector would undermine confidence, and printing a ton of rubles could spark further inflation by increasing the overall money supply. Nonetheless, a drop in confidence could be offset by fiscal stimulus, which is what the Kremlin did after the 2008 financial crisis. And really, inflation has been more of an inconvenience than a real threat to Putin and his regime. It's also worth noting that thanks to sanctions, Russia is basically a closed economy already, so there's little risk of meaningful capital flight, which could otherwise trigger a proper economic crisis. Anyway, under this analysis, the bad loans add to the economic risks currently facing the Kremlin, but they don't represent a fundamentally new challenge, nor do they pose a more acute problem for Putin and co. than the other slow-burning issues facing the Russian economy, like inflation. Analysts who subscribe to this interpretation generally conclude that, while escalating sanctions might not be a bad idea, they are unlikely to provide the knockout blow that Western politicians are actually looking for. There's a lot of difficult decisions necessary here, and making huge decisions, especially quickly, is difficult, even for world leaders. The good thing is that brilliant is where you learn by doing, with thousands of interactive lessons in maths, data, programming, and AI. Their interactive classes can help build your critical thinking skills through problem solving, not memorizing. So while you're building real knowledge on specific topics, you'll also be becoming a better thinker. For instance, their Predicting with Probability course can help you better understand and assess the world around you. You can learn to wrangle massive data sets, compare distributions, and master fundamental concepts like Bayes' theorem. Now that might sound a little technical, but with their active learning, you'll learn this by answering questions like, which airline is most likely to have a delay due to weather? And how much more unruly have airline passengers gotten since the pandemic? Data skills are absolutely necessary for navigating our modern world, and Brilliant is the best way to get them. So try everything that Brilliant has to offer for free for a full 30 days by visiting brilliant.org/TLDR, or by clicking the link in the description. And by doing so, you'll also get 20% off an annual premium subscription.